Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. That's the second part of the introduction to the history, to the culture of the 19th century. And today I'd like to talk with you about the Regency period, or more specifically, not only the Regency, that is the years between 1811 and 1820, when the Prince of Wales, future George IV, ruled as Prince Regent in place of his father George III, but more broadly the period before the accession of Queen Victoria in 1837. So this is quite a long period. Many people tend to disregard it when they think about the 19th century in Britain. They tend to think about the Victorian period and Victoria's reign exclusively, but it's almost 40 years. And if we take the long 19th century from the French Revolution, it's even longer. So quite a lot happened in this period, like 2 generations before Victoria even came to the throne. However, she was born in 1818, which is an interesting story in itself. So I guess it's a good idea to start here before we start talking about Victorian culture, Victorian society, and all those rather typical, if not stereotypical, things connected with Victorianism. So the last decades of the long reign of King George III, then George IV between 1820 and 1830, and then for 7 years between 1830 and 1837, his brother William IV. They are sometimes, these 2 last monarchs, George IV and William IV, they are sometimes called in English historical studies, and this is the term that appeared as soon as Victoria came to the throne. They started to be called the wicked uncles. The wicked uncles. They were, of course, Victoria's uncles. Victoria's father was their younger brother, but by the time Victoria came to the throne, he was already long dead. So why would these 2 uncles be so wicked? What was so wrong about them? Well, definitely they were not well liked by the subjects, but let's look why. So those of you who have seen the feature film The Madness of King George know already that George III suffered in his later life those bouts of crippling illness, which the contemporaries called madness. It's been quite a mystery what happened to him and why he had those mental problems. Probably now the most widespread hypothesis, the explanation of what was wrong with King George III, is that he suffered from a genetic disorder called porphyria, which was untreated. Well, of course, the state of medicine did not allow for effective treatment of this condition. So among other symptoms, it gave psychological symptoms. If you've watched the film or the theatre version, there is a very good theatre play on which the film was based. You know, it ends on a positive note. The king recovers. However, a few years later, he was ill again. Some say this was caused by a personal tragedy of the death of his youngest daughter. King George and his queen Charlotte, a German princess, this was something very typical for the Hanoverians. They were a German dynasty to begin with, so all the 4 Georges, and there were 4 kings named George in succession, so George the First, the Second, the Third, and the Fourth. not very popular in England. If you know this humorous TV program, the Horrible Histories, there was a funny little song made about the first four Georges. They were dressed up like a boys band, and they sang, I was the bad one, and I was the sad one, I was the mad one, and I was the fat one. So it more or less sums up the first four kings from the Hanoverian dynasty. They were the Protestant dynasty that was invited to the British throne by the Parliament after the Stuarts, or at least the Protestant line of the Stuarts, died out. So the last Stuart monarch, Queen Anne, she probably broke the record for royal pregnancies in Britain. She was pregnant at least 17 times, but none of her children survived childhood. Many of them were stillborn, some died in infancy. There was one little boy who survived until his 11th birthday, but then he caught something and died. So poor Queen Anne died leaving no heirs, and the Parliament decided to look for a next Protestant relative, leaving out the Catholic branch of the Stuarts that lived in exile in France after the Glorious Revolution, which caused some problems, especially in Scotland. We have the Jacobite rebellion because the Stuart family still had some supporters in Scotland, despite the fact that they were Catholics. But in England, the most important thing, at least for the Parliament, was that the ruling dynasty should be Protestant. So the Prince of sorry, not COVID yet. The Prince of Hanover was invited to the British throne, and then his descendants carried on the Hanoverian line. By that time, Hanover became a small kingdom as well, so there were kings of Hanover rather than princes. So King George III was the third in line after his great-grandfather and his grandfather. His father unfortunately died before his grandfather, so he took the throne very young, and he followed his grandfather. That's why he had such a long reign. He married a German princess because she was Protestant. Some historians say that she was extremely ugly. I don't think so. Really, the portraits do not support this claim, and whatever her looks, they seem to be quite happy, or at least comfortable together. They had 15 children, 15 surviving children. Some of them did not survive for very long. A few died in childhood, but the vast majority of these children survived into adulthood and started getting married and started producing children of their own. But unfortunately, the eldest sons, at least, did not for a long time have legitimate offspring. The princes, like George, the Prince of Wales, and William, the Duke of Clarence, and Edward, the Duke of Kent, were regarded as spendthrifts and womanizers, and basically party animals who would squander the public money on their private pleasures. The first of these sons, George, named after his father, later to become Prince Regent and even later to become George IV, was an especially, I would say, drastic example of party living. He was quite a controversial figure. He took little interest in politics, but he loved spending money on parties and food. He was quite overweight. He was the fat one of the Georges. Some historians say that he was the largest physically king to ever sit on the British throne. Here we have a caricature of George. Early 19th century, the turn of the century, is really the great moment for a genre in art of political caricature. So you would have very big influence of the printed media, of the printed cartoons, of the newspapers and magazines that start appearing in this period. The literacy of the people is growing. So, but even those who could not read could go to a printer's shop and see the new caricatures of the aristocracy and the royal family displayed in the shop window, like this one. The future George IV as an obese, lazy, drunk glutton. So this was the opinion about the Prince of Wales. Some of the caricaturists went as far as to call him the Prince of Wales, not Wales, the big marine mammals. So, and another thing that he was famous for was the great parties he threw in his lavish royal pavilion in Brighton. If you ever go to Brighton, see British Pavilion. For now, watch the documentary, the 3-part documentary by Lucy Worsley about Regency. Some parts of this actually showed the exterior and the interior of the Royal Pavilion, so you'll know what I mean. This was a splendid palace, very exotic looking, shockingly exotic for the contemporary. From the outside it looks something a little bit like Taj Mahal, something Indian perhaps. From the inside it looks Chinese, so it's all gold and reds and dragons, and it's absolutely splendid, over the top, the kind of thing that really shows the personality of the Prince Regent. An interesting thing is that he employed the best chef, the best French chef he could get, and there were many good French chefs looking for employment after the French Revolution, and he was so proud of it that he actually included the kitchen into the palace, and he decorated the kitchen lavishly because he would invite his own guests there to be entertained by this splendid staff who made wonderful meals, and of course it did nothing good for the prince's weight. He had many mistresses. This was also the stuff of caricatures because George in his youth tended to like ladies who were slightly older than him and also rather plump. So there was this overweight prince with his overweight mistresses, a kind of matronly type, which was of course ridiculed, but he couldn't marry any of them. The point was that royal marriages were had to be approved by the king and by the parliament. The reason is the royal princes were funded by the parliament, so they could not marry anyone they pleased. And neither the king nor the parliament supported the choices of the Prince of Wales. His great love, a woman he really wanted to marry, was called Maria Fitzherbert, and she was Catholic. She was, if I remember correctly, she was a widow. So this went against the convention that the future king should marry a virgin. And it definitely went against the law that the future king should marry Protestant lady. So he had a long affair with her. No illegitimate children, unlike some of his brothers, but he was not allowed to marry her. The situation was getting bad when the king's, George III's, health started to deteriorate. The parliament started to influence some sort of pressure on the Prince of Wales to find a legitimate German Protestant princess and father and heir to secure the succession of the throne. He finally relented. Unfortunately for himself, he asked one of his former mistresses to find a suitable princess. And imagine yourself being a royal mistress. Who would you find? Probably someone who would not pose much threat to your position at court, and this was the situation that happened to the Prince of Wales. His friend, Lady Jersey, found an appropriate German princess from a small principality of Brunswick, Caroline of Brunswick, who was young, who was very likely a virgin, who was Protestant, so she was absolutely legit in this case. But when the prince saw her for the first time, this was more or less like the reaction of Henry VIII to Anne of Cleves. He didn't like her. He just didn't like her. There were all kinds of rumors, like why he didn't like her. Probably it was just a case of personal taste. Also, the fact that he was not very attractive, to say the least, and she was probably not impressed by his looks either, so she didn't show any enthusiasm for the prospect of becoming his wife. Another thing is that despite his weight, George was a very fashionable man. He followed the fashion. He had a special kind of fashion advisor and a close friend for a time called George Brummel, or Beau Brummel, who was the leading dandy, as the word went then. So a fashion influencer, you might say. The man who is sometimes credited for inventing the modern canon of male elegance. So a dark suit made of wool rather than colorful silk embroidered costume of the 18th century, and wigs. So he was the one to persuade the Prince of Wales to give up the wigs and start dressing up like a man, in the modern sense, of course. So George was a man of fashion. He liked perfume. He was quite cultured. He was a very big fan of Jane Austen's novels, for example. And Caroline was a bit provincial. She didn't care about fashion. Probably her family didn't have the money to follow fashion closely. Apparently she smelled, well, we'll never know, but this was the rumor, that she had some body odor problem. Probably she didn't bathe as often as the prince. Anyway, the marriage was a disaster. There is an interesting kind of feature documentary, like a biopic, called The Royal Scandal. If you want to know more about this disastrous marriage, look it up, The Royal Scandal. But they fulfilled their duty. They had a daughter. They gave her name Charlotte, after George's mother, and they promptly separated. They produced this one child together and they went their separate ways. Princess Charlotte was probably the first royal celebrity, like Victoria and I don't know, Princess Margaret and Princess Diana, and the royals now, like Kate Middleton and and the present generation of the British royals. The first royal celebrity was Princess Charlotte. The press loved her. She was pretty, witty, charming, and the future Queen of England. So everything that the press liked. She survived childhood. She grew up, and it was the good moment to try and find her a husband. And she married one of the most handsome princes of this generation, a very poor German Protestant prince called Leopold of Saxon-Coburg. There was a small principality in Germany called Coburg that didn't have any natural resources except for a brood of handsome princes. So when there was a necessity to employ a handsome prince, this is where they would go. So Prince Leopold married Princess Charlotte. They were again a kind of celebrity couple for a while. Very quickly she became pregnant. The press loved it. She went into labor. She gave birth to a son. Yeah, great. But unfortunately, due to the complications in childbirth, both the child and very soon the mother, Princess Charlotte, died. So like 2 generations of future British monarchs died within a few hours of each other. This was a national tragedy. This was really something horrible. Also for the Prince Regent, who was left with the wife he didn't love, and now no surviving heir. He tried to divorce Caroline of Brunswick, but if you know anything about the legal side of divorce in the early 19th century, the only way to do it was through an act of parliament. And they had a kind of court case, let's say, before the parliament. And the parliament, influenced by the public opinion, so basically the press and the middle class, who were the avid readers of the press, refused to give the Prince Regent the divorce he wanted. So he could marry another princess and perhaps father some more children, although his health was nothing good at that time. So what we have is a kind of political crisis that shows for the first time the great political influence of the middle class after the French Revolution. So they never divorced. He was crowned George the Fourth after his father died, finally, in 1820. Actually, Caroline died a few weeks after the coronation. There was a massive scandal. She tried to enter Westminster Abbey to be crowned together with her husband. He prevented that. He told the guards not to let her in. She banged on the door. There was a massive scandal. So she died a few weeks later. Some say of a broken heart. Probably she had cancer. But George was too ill and basically aging, so he never married again, and it was quite obvious that he would not leave an heir. So his next in line would be his younger brother William, the Duke of Clarence. Also not a very popular type. He did not marry. He lived in an illegitimate union with an actress called Dorothy Jordan, a comic actress to say the more. They had 10 illegitimate children. He loved them. He was a good husband, a partner and a good father, but again he could have no hopes of the parliament and his brother, the king, ever allowing him to marry Mrs. Jordan. He was not really an intellectual. He was sometimes called Silly Billy or Billy the Sailor because in his youth he had some experience with the Navy. And when Princess Charlotte died, he had to part with his long-time mistress and find a proper German princess called Adelaide of Saxe-Meiningen. Charming, shy young woman, marry her and try to produce an heir. It didn't work out. They had some children, but they all died in infancy, so they were like desperately trying to have a child. It didn't really work out. So the next in line would be the next brother, Edward, the Duke of Kent. Brother number 4, there was one more brother between these two, but he died relatively young. And this would be the father of the future Queen Victoria. We continue in a moment.